The sound was the only thing that mattered in that moment. It wasn't the sound of the two large men shouting threats from my driveway. It wasn't the sound of their leader, Brenda, the president of the Homeowners Association, screaming encouragement at them from the safety of the street. It wasn't even the sound of my own heart, a frantic, wild drum against my ribs, no. The only sound that mattered was the one I made myself. It was the deep, oiled, and utterly unmistakable shit-shuck of a shell. The sound was a full stop at the end of a long and very stupid sentence. It echoed in the quiet forest that surrounded my cabin, a sound of absolute mechanical finality. And on my driveway, the two thugs who had just broken the lock on my gate and were marching toward my house, they froze, mid-stride, their faces, which had been masks of smug, aggressive confidence, turned into pale, slack-jawed canvases of pure primal terror. Across the street, Brenda's shrill, triumphant shrieking died in her throat, replaced by a strangled, horrified gasp. I stood on my porch, the heavy, familiar weight of the shotgun held at a low, safe, but very ready position. I didn't point it at them. I didn't have to. The sound had done all the talking for me. And in the beautiful, terrible, and ringing silence that followed, I knew the deep and satisfying certainty that the war was finally over. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files to understand that moment, that perfect, terrifying standoff between a quiet woman who just wanted to be left alone and the bullies who wouldn't let her. You have to understand the life I had before and the peace I was fighting to protect. My name is Sarah. For 10 years, my life was a world of controlled chaos. I was a combat medic in the Army. I've done tours in places where the line between life and death is a razor's edge, where the only thing that matters is your training, your discipline, and the person standing next to you. I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other, and I've seen the best. When I finished my service, I came home with a medal for valor, a lifetime of memories I didn't want, and a deep, gnawing case of PTSD, the noise of the city, the crowds, the sudden sound. It was all too much. I craved silence. I craved solitude. I craved a place where I could feel safe, a place where I could finally, truly come home. I found it in my family's old cabin. It was a beautiful, historic log cabin on a 50-acre parcel of pristine, untouched forest. A piece of land my great-grandfather had bought a century ago. It was an in-holding, a private sanctuary completely surrounded by a new, massive, and aggressively manicured development called Whispering Woods. The cabin was my inheritance, my refuge. The one place on earth I could begin to heal. The problem was that my sanctuary bordered on a kingdom, and that kingdom had a queen. The queen's name was Brenda. It's the president of the Whispering Woods HOA. Brenda was a woman who seemed to be powered by a mixture of profound insecurity and an equally profound sense of her own importance. She was a tyrant of the trivial, a woman who saw the world as a series of infractions that only she could correct. And my quiet, secluded, and stubbornly independent property was, in her eyes, a profound and unforgivable infraction. Our first meeting was a week after I moved in. I was on my porch, just enjoying the quiet, when her electric golf cart came gliding silently up my long driveway. She didn't come to welcome me. She came to assess me. She looked at my simple, rustic cabin, the wild flowers I was letting grow in the clearing, at me, a quiet, single woman in her 30s, dressed in an old army sweatshirt and jeans, and her eyes were filled with a deep and immediate suspicion. "Hello," she'd said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet woods. "I'm Brenda, the president of the association. I don't believe we've seen you at any of the community mixers." "I'm Sarah," I'd said. "I'm a private person. I came here for the quiet." "Yes. Well," she said, her eyes narrowing. "This is a community. We value knowing who our neighbors are. For safety, you understand? I've taken the liberty of bringing you the community's welcome packet." She handed me a thick binder. "It contains all of our covenants and a list of our pet restrictions. I've highlighted the section on dangerous breeds. We have a zero-tolerance policy. The insult was clear. My beautiful, gentle, and impeccably trained golden retriever, who was lying at my feet, was in her eyes. A dangerous breed. This property isn't part of your HOA. Brenda, I'd said, my voice polite but firm, but thank you for the information. The look she gave me was one of pure, venomous disbelief. I had not just refused to play her game. I had informed her that I was not even on her board. We'll see about that, she'd hissed, and sped off. The war had begun. The first barrage was a formal demand letter, informing me that it was mandatory for all properties within the visual and logistical sphere of Whispering Woods. To join the HOA, it was, of course, a complete legal fabrication. I had my lawyer, a woman who worked with a veterans advocacy group, send a polite but legally devastating letter back, clarifying my properties and holding status, and respectfully telling them to pound sand. Brenda, unable to conquer me with legal fictions, turned to a campaign of paranoid harassment. She started a smear campaign. She told the other residents that I was an unstable veteran, that she had heard strange shouting coming from my property in the middle of the night. She was trying to paint me as a threat, as the crazy lady in the woods. She even filed a false wellness check call with the local sheriff's department. A classic and deeply insulting harassment tactic that resulted in 2 very embarrassed deputies showing up at my door to make sure I wasn't a danger to myself or others. My inner monologue was a raging torrent. I had come here to heal, to escape the ghosts of my past. And this woman, this petty suburban tyrant, was actively trying to paint me as the very thing I was fighting so hard not to be. My training, the part of me that had been forged in the crucible of combat, was screaming at me to confront the threat. But the other part of me, the tired, wounded part, just wanted to be left alone. Then, Brenda and her board passed a new, even more insidious bylaw. It was a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak. It granted the HOA's newly formed Code Enforcement and Community Safety Committee, which consisted of her husband, Gary, and his equally bumbling best friend, the right to perform routine visual inspections of any and all adjacent properties, to ensure that they posed no threat to the safety, security, and aesthetic harmony of the community. It was a completely illegal bylaw. A transparent attempt to give her goons a legal pretext to trespass on my land. This was a new level of threat. This was a direct assault on my safety and my privacy. That afternoon, I went to work. I installed a state-of-the-art military-grade security system, motion sensors, infrared tripwires, and a series of high-definition night vision cameras, all linked to a secure server and to my phone. My quiet, peaceful cabin was now a hard target. I didn't have to wait long. My cameras caught them. 2 nights later, at 3 a.m., I was woken by a silent alert on my phone, and I watched with a cold, hard knot of rage in my stomach. The live footage of Brenda's 2 agents, Gary and his friend, climbing my fence and creeping through the woods towards my cabin, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were trying to peek into my windows. The evidence was undeniable, crystal clear, and deeply, profoundly creepy. I sent a copy of the high-definition video to the HOA's lawyer, the final, unambiguous, cease and desist warning. I informed him that the next time any representative of his association set foot on my property, I would not be sending a letter. I would be filing a criminal complaint for felony trespassing. I thought foolishly that this would be it. A clear video of a criminal act. The threat of actual real-world jail time. Surely even Brenda would understand that she had finally crossed a line. But her response was to escalate beyond all reason. A final, threatening letter arrived. It wasn't from her lawyer. It was from the HOA itself, written and signed by Brenda. It was a poorly written, hysterical, and deeply unhinged tirade. It declared my property a clear and present danger to the community. It accused me of hostile and intimidating behavior, and it informed me that the HOA, using its own newly created nuisance abatement powers, would be taking direct, decisive, and practical action if I did not immediately submit to a full and unconditional property inspection by her agents within the next 24 hours. And that brings us to that terrible afternoon. The 24-hour deadline had passed. I was in my kitchen, a sense of deep, gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. And then, the alert on my phone buzzed. The motion sensor at my front gate. I pulled up the live feed. And I saw them. Her two goons, they weren't just at the gate. They had bolt cutters. And as I watched, with a feeling of pure, helpless horror, they snapped the heavy-duty lock and chain I had installed. They were on my property. They were walking towards my house. It had crossed the line from a campaign of harassment to a full-blown home invasion. I did two things, almost simultaneously. My training took over. First, I calmly and quietly called 911. I reported a home invasion in progress. I'm giving a full detailed description of the two intruders in their last known location, my driveway. Second, I went to the old, locked gun cabinet my father had left me. I unlocked it, and I took out the shotgun. The standoff was a thing of beautiful, terrifying simplicity. I was on the line with the 911 dispatcher, giving her a calm, real-time account of the situation. While I watched the two men on my security monitor, they reached my porch. They pounded on the door. HOA business, open up. One of them yelled. When the pounding didn't work, they put their shoulders to the door. It was a heavy, solid oak door, and it held. For now, Brenda had, by this time, arrived at the scene, was standing at the bottom of my driveway, yelling encouragement. And that's when I made my move. I ended the call with the dispatcher. I walked to my front door, and I didn't open it. I walked out the back door, shotgun in hand, and, using the cover of the woods I knew so well, I circled around to the front porch, emerging from the side, a silent, unexpected presence, and I racked the shotgun. That shuck-shuck sound. It was the only sound that mattered. It cut through their grunting. It cut through Brenda's shrieking, and it stopped them cold. The look of pure primal, deeply satisfying terror on their faces is a look I will cherish for the rest of my life. They had come here to bully a woman they thought was a weak, unstable victim. They had instead found a calm, disciplined, and very well-armed combat veteran on her own property. In a state where the castle doctrine is not just a suggestion, but a cherished tradition, I didn't point the gun at them. My weapon discipline, drilled into me by a decade of training, was absolute. I held it at a low, safe, but very, very ready position. And I used the voice I had learned to use on the battlefield, the voice of calm, absolute command. You are trespassing on my property. And you are attempting to force entry into my home, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden ringing silence. That is a felony. You will now get on the ground, face down, with your hands behind your head. You will do it now. They didn't just comply. They collapsed. Two large, pathetic, whimpering piles of broken bravado on my porch, and then the sirens. The beautiful sound of the cavalry arriving, the sheriff and his deputies, arriving in force, expecting a bloodbath, found a scene of perfect, controlled, and deeply confusing order. They found two grown men, one of whom had actually wet himself, crying on my porch. And they found me, a calm, quiet woman with a shotgun, right, standing guard over them. Brenda, of course, was still screaming from the street. She was screaming that I was the one who was crazy, that I was the one who had threatened them, that they were the victims. I calmly and safely unloaded the shotgun and secured it inside the house. And then I directed the sheriff, a man I had, thankfully, met before, to the multiple high-definition security cameras that had recorded the entire beautiful and damning incident. He reviewed the footage. He saw the bolt cutters. He saw them breaking my lock. He saw them trying to break down my door. He saw me, emerging calmly, my weapon held in a safe, non-threatening position. He saw my calm verbal commands, and he saw their immediate, terrified compliance. The two thugs, now in handcuffs, sang like canaries. They told the deputies everything. That Brenda had hired them. That she had paid them a $500 bonus to get the door open. no matter what, that this was all part of her long-standing campaign to force me to join her HOA. And so, Brenda, the great and powerful queen of Whispering Woods, was arrested, right there on the street in front of my house, for conspiracy to commit breaking and entering, a felony, for filing a false police report, for a dozen other charges that the district attorney was now very interested in. The legal consequences for Brenda were, and are, catastrophic. Her 2 hired goons, of course, testified against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. The HOA was hit with a massive and unwinnable lawsuit from me for damages, for harassment, for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The board, which had been her silent, complicit enablers, was forced to resign in disgrace. My home, my sanctuary, was finally, truly secure. The story of the crazy vet lady who had single-handedly, and without firing a shot, taken down the entire corrupt HOA leadership became a local legend. This whole brutal, terrifying, and ultimately triumphant war taught me a profound lesson about the nature of strength and the nature of fear. Brenda was driven by an irrational, baseless fear of what she didn't understand. She saw a woman living alone, a veteran, a person who did not conform to her narrow, suburban worldview, and she invented a threat in her own head. And to combat this imaginary threat, she unleashed a real one. She failed to understand that the very things that made her fear me, my training, my discipline, my calm under pressure, my refusal to be intimidated, were the very things that made me uniquely and perfectly qualified to deal with the ugly, real-world threat she had so foolishly brought to my front door. She thought she was poking a victim. She had no idea she was kicking a hornet's nest. Brenda is facing serious jail time, and the HOA is currently being liquidated to pay the settlement for my lawsuit. But her son, a high-powered and notoriously aggressive attorney from a big city firm, has just been appointed as the pro bono legal counsel for the now bankrupt HOA, and he's just filed a new massive civil suit against me for brandishing a weapon and causing his mother and her 2 associates severe and lasting emotional distress.